Okay, and we're back for the magic of subjective criteria. The last one was objective criteria, meaning they are something independent of my particular opinion, right? If your camera is tilted, it's tilted, right? You can say it's good, you can say it's bad, but it is objectively tilted. We're going to talk a little bit now about some things that are more subjective. So, um, things that I can make a case for, things I can make an argument for, things are looking or being a certain way, that they are doing one thing or another. And I'm not going to tell you anything that I do not think is actually literally true, right? So I'm not going to, subjective. I think I'm right, but everybody thinks they're right. And they're not all right. I'm more right than most. Not everybody's right. So we'll talk about these. They're going to be things where there is um, interpretation happening. So subjective criteria. This is one of the things we talk about in terms of um, graphic composition. So this is pictured by Edward Weston. It's pretty famous. You probably, well, I don't know, probably. You may have seen it before. It is out there in the interwebs. It is a bell pepper, right? Looks remarkably like a human figure, like someone's back. Hmm. Um, but it's not, it's a bell pepper. So you can think about how this thing lays out in the frame, right? So you have these curves wrapping up here, the light, the shadow, all of these things are defining what this shape is, right? So I can talk about this and say, okay, well, I can sort of follow my eye wrapping up this shape. These two things kind of curl around in bringing my eye back down. The sort of shadow around the entire shape um, brings your eye to this central form. That's what I think is happening in the picture. That's how I think this picture is functioning graphically, visually, right? So it's not the same as like, oh, it's too dark, oh, it's too light, oh, it's tilted, right? Objective things about this would be like, okay, well, there's like very dark shadow down there and lighter areas down here, right? That would be objective. We could all agree on that. Um, but the way that this sort of organic shape functions, the way that it directs your eye, those are things that I might have to convince you of. More organic forms, right? So this is a person. It is in the grand photographic tradition of naked ladies, right? Which is kind of problematic, but it's a whole big chunk of old dudes taking pictures of young naked women. Also Edward Weston, right? So that's one of the reasons why I have them here. A, they're sort of old classic pictures. B, two things by the same person, both of them exploring ideas of composition, framing, tonality. Um, a lot of the pictures that take tonality and framing and graphic composition as their subject are going to be older. Photography as a discipline has tended to move along from that, right? We've been like, okay, great, you can get some shapes and things and lay them out in this rectangle, but what else can you do? And we'll look at some people who are doing more than that pretty much through the entire semester. But Edward Weston, again, back at the beginning of photography, but early days still, um, working with sort of more exclusively aesthetic notions of what photography was trying to do. Notions of beauty, therefore composition, tone, all that stuff. These are also black and white, right? So tone is entering into it more than, say, color. So things that are super interesting about this, right? A, it's more interesting than a bell pepper because it's a person, right? We naturally are drawn to the human figure more than we are to, say, a picture of a rock or a picture of a carrot. Even with a bell pepper, we start to interpret it in terms of how does it look like the human body, right? So that natural tendency to see things in terms of people, right? To think of things in terms of the person being depicted or the person viewing, will run through all of photography. So this picture here, we can start to break it down compositionally. there are these three axes. We can see one coming up here, right? One going over there. Sorry, trying to trace my finger on the screen. And then behind her head over here, a third one coming down. So you have these planes, right? The plane of the floor down here, this wall plane right there, that wall plane right there. Those three things come together and create this corner that gives you a three-dimensional space that she occupies. Unlike the bell pepper, right? The bell pepper is just floating in the void. Doo-doo-doo. Right, where is the bell pepper? It's just like in this nowhere space. She is grounded in this corner, right? There's a floor, there's two walls. We can also start to see the lines and sort of track those lines going around here, right? There is this sort of oval that is her head, right? That shape right there. There's a second oval that is her arms, right there. There's this triangle formed by her legs coming up there, right? And then this additional triangle there in the middle, which will also be like, little like, kind of crotch-like. So again, all of this idea of drawing you in, there is a sort of eroticism to it. The thing that I think is really interesting about this picture is how does this sort of motion of the viewer, sort of how the viewer looks at the picture, how does that get started? So we think about, we see this person, we know they're a person, we look and see where they're looking, right? It's the first thing, because like you run into somebody in the jungle, right? And you're like, hey, and they're like, oh, right? You want to look and see what they're looking at because maybe it's a tiger and you're both going to get eaten, right? So we have a natural tendency to look and see what someone else is looking at. This is a whole thing where you go and stand on the street and like look up like this, and people will walk by and look up like that to see what it is you're looking at. So we see her, we wonder what she's looking at. That sort of tracks our eye down around that shape, right? Sort of spinning then into that triangle, into this sort of like weird dark crotch space. So on one level, this is all, shapes, right? There's like the oval of the head, there's the oval of the arms, there are these triangles here, there are these planes that surround her. But on another level, all of those things are put there to direct your eye, to pull you in, to engage you as a viewer with that picture. So here's the two of them. Again, both sort of organic forms, both human body related, right? I know one's a bell pepper, but it still has a muscularity to it that echoes certainly the human form, and both organic, right? These are very much, I mean, nobody's wearing any clothes, right? All you have is sort of this like live, moving, sort of made out of something shape that is a pepper on one hand and a person on the other. Charles Sheeler. So these were Edward Weston, Charles Sheeler. Charles Sheeler, also known as a painter. If you go and look at his paintings, I think they're actually fantastic. As much as I like this picture, I actually like his paintings a great deal more. Very sort of modernism, right? Like, oh, we're coming into this big new technological thing, and like, look how great it is. But incredibly strong graphic composition. The way that these lines sort of cross one another. The way that those smokestacks behind shoot up and almost, but not quite, touching the top of that frame. This is all, again, done with like light and shadow, right? So the fact that you have those big dark spaces underneath, right, gives a strength to those diagonal lines. Having that lighter sky behind, right, gives them something to pop out against. The way that these two lines run into the edges of the frame, right? So you have those two lines crossing, and they hit the edges of the picture frame, if I can point to it. And that sort of grounds them as being the furthest forward thing, right? As they touch the edges of the picture, they become part of that sort of piece of paper that the picture is printed on, right? The things beyond them then are back in this three-dimensional space. If you think about the bell pepper, right? The bell pepper is operating inside of this round three-dimensional space kind of floating there in the void. The woman was operating, there in that sort of space defined by those three planes. Here, those crossing axes connect to the edge of the frame, anchor them as the front object. Behind them then is this water tower, right? And then behind that are those smokestacks going up and almost but not quite touching the top of the frame, right? Them doing that, right? Had they touched the top of the frame, they would then be the same as these things are, right? They would sort of like pop into flatness. But because they come up and almost but not quite touch it, you have this tension there, and they're still able to remain in this three-dimensional deep space. Roy de Carava. We're moving a little bit forward. Roy de Carava, I have the date on here, 1949. I was going to say 50s, so almost. Roy de Carava is a photographer working in New York, working in Harlem. And you can see now, right, if you think about the previous picture, what is this picture about? It's sort of about technology and the factory, and it's sort of heroic, and it's America and making stuff and whatever, right? It's also just sort of like graphic prettiness, right? The same thing here, right? These pictures are aesthetic in their beauty, right? That is the thing that they are trying to do, is to make a picture where you're like, wow, that's pretty. And this is not to say that that's a terrible thing, right? Like, pretty is all right. I would rather look at something pretty than look at something that looks like shit. But that is sort of what they're communicating. This is not a bell pepper picture about hunger, right? It's just not. Roy de Carava, this is a picture called Graduation, 1949, and he now is using these ideas of graphic composition. I'll step out of the way of the picture. And ooh, blurry. Using these ideas of graphic composition and taking them to another level, right? Using them to communicate something. So first, look at the graphics, right? So we have this shape, this jagged, almost knife-like shape coming down over her head, right? So it's like this ominous sword pointy thing coming down here. She's standing here on this sort of narrow peninsula that is lit up, right? The rest of it's just darkness all around her. And so she seems to be standing at this edge, at this border, looking out at this almost, cliff that's petering off into nothing. So there's a sense of isolation. There's a sense of this ominousness of this thing hanging down over the top of her. She exists in three dimensions, right? Because she has, her shadow finishes. So finishes meaning it is visible and has space around it in the photograph, right? So if it were cut off at the edge, right, it would not finish. It is not cut off at the edge. It finishes. So she manages to be there in three dimensions in this space, right? That increases her isolation. It means that she is not connected to something that's just off frame, right? For all we know, it's like all of her friends and family are sitting out there right outside the frame about to give her a new car. But you don't see that, and she feels more isolated because of the fact that she is in this three-dimensional space by herself, not like making that connection off frame to anyone or anything, right? And then what else is going on, right? So she has this like fancy dress, right? It says graduation. So there's this moment of transition from one moment in life to another, right? A lot of you probably just went through this. And she's standing there in this fancy dress, in this trash-strewn empty lot, right? Black woman, right? Staring out at this icon of American middle classness, the Chevrolet, literally driving away from her, right? So she's at this moment of transition. She is on this literal, visually at least, edge, precipice, boundary between one state and another. needing to make that leap, cross forward into another place, right? And everything out in front of her is just sort of dark and trash strewn and frightening. It is not an optimistic picture, right? It's a picture about what she is facing as she makes this transition. It's a picture of, how America is giving, or in this case, not giving her those opportunities. So this is a picture which uses those ideas of composition, of layout, to not just make something that is pretty, quote unquote, but to make something that's compelling and gives you a meaning in the picture, right? It draws your eyes to these things. It gives you this sense of, okay, here's this peninsula where she's like going out into the world, standing on this edge. It tracks your eye across to that Chevrolet, right? It gives you that feeling of the oppression of this coming down here. It makes her feel more isolated, right? By having her be there in 3 dimensions, finishing that shadow. So Roy de Carava is using these principles of graphic composition, and in addition to making something that's a compelling visual image that draws your eye into it, that engages you, that makes you look at it again, he's using it to talk about society. So this is a picture which I think is better, right, than a pepper in a can. They're doing different things. They were setting out to do different things. I'm not saying that Weston is a worse photographer than de Carava, but this is a picture which is using those tools and doing something more compelling with them. So here again, right? So this is graphic composition, more geometric lines, tones, shapes, drawing your eye through it, creating 3-dimensional space, moving you from one thing to another, making something subject, something else background. Very compelling.